Good evening all, and welcome. Before the video begins, I have the pleasure to announce the winner of last week's competition for the amazing original piece of artwork. And the winner is Sheila Ankta. I hope I pronounced that right. Congratulations. Please enable messages from other users on your YouTube channel so that Creeks and Peaks can get in touch with you in regards to claiming your awesome prize. I hope you enjoy. The Deep Woods, where some go to find peace and tranquility, and where others go to find you. It's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This story happened in the early spring of 2010. My wife and I were heading up to my folks' cabin in upstate New Hampshire for the weekend. We both had to work later than usual, so we knew we weren't going to be arriving until around 1 AM or so. This wasn't really a problem since we lived in Massachusetts and the drive was typically only 4 hours or so depending on traffic. Now, the cabin itself is on a small and very secluded lake and the very end of a dead, dirt, private road. Its isolation is largely part of the appeal. There is no phone, and in order to get any cell reception at all, you have to drive a few miles into town. There is only one other house on our side of the lake, and only 6 cabins in total on the entire lake. So, it's pretty much as about secluded as you can get. In modern day New England anyway. As a matter of fact, in order to even get to the private road, you have to drive a mile down another dirt road, cross a causeway that crosses a narrow point in the lake, and then take a fork in the road with signs that plainly state dead end, private drive, and even then, it's another 1/4 of a mile to the cabin. So basically, this isn't the type of place people would typically stumble across. So we get to town a little after 1 AM and swing through the nearby gas station, hoping to pick up some snacks for the rest of the night. However, not much to my surprise, the gas station was closed. But we had picked up beer before we left, so we could wait until morning to get supplies and still have a good night. Well, after circling around and we are pulling out of the gas station, I then notice the lights of a pickup truck turn on the back of the station. I didn't really think about it. I had no reason to. I was honestly just excited to get to the cabin and start the weekend. From the gas station, it's about 10 miles to the cabin, and all the roads are unlit and pretty rural. After a minute or so, I noticed headlights in my mirror and assumed it was the same truck that I had seen at the gas station. I didn't mention it to my wife because I didn't really think that they were following us and didn't want to creep her out. But the more I thought about it, I thought it was really strange for a truck to be just sitting at the back of the gas station with the lights off. But after seeing the truck take the second turn behind us, I started to worry. It was almost 1:30 AM, in the middle of nowhere. Why was this truck on the road? And more importantly, why had it taken the same turns as us 4 times by now? This went on for about 5 minutes, and as I approached the first dirt road that would take us to the cabin, I thought about driving past it and making a few random turns to see if it would follow us. However, part of me still thought I was being stupid and paranoid. Plus, I also didn't want to alert my wife that I thought we were being followed. So I decided to make the turn, but I didn't use my turn signal. About 10 seconds later, I saw the truck turn in behind us. My alarm bells start going like crazy. I can't stress enough how unlikely it would have been for someone other than us to be heading down this particular road, especially at this time of night. Like I said before, there are only 6 cabins on the lake. There are 2 chances to turn off towards other cabins before the fork to our private road, and I watched in utter dismay as the truck passed the first turnoff. "Is that your neighbour?" asked my wife. She had apparently been paying close attention to the truck as well. "No, I don't think so. I don't know who that is," I replied, which was true. I could tell the truck was dark and was raised up, as my neighbour drove an old red pickup. "Weird. Do you think they're following us?" "I don't know. Probably not. Perhaps they are just lost." I could tell that she was nervous by the tone in her voice, but I tried to play it cool and act like nothing was wrong, despite the fact that I was completely on edge. The second turnoff came and went. The truck was still behind us. The causeway across to the other side of the lake was coming up, and after it was the fork that led to our cabin. Once you hit the causeway, the only chance you have to turn around is at the cabin itself. The 2 roads that fork off are not only dead ends, but they are 1 lane only. So you have to drive to the end and actually turn around in our driveway, or my neighbours. As we came up to the causeway, my heart sank. It was spring, so all the melted snow had raised the lake water's level way higher than I thought it would be. Judging by how high the water was at the causeway, I knew our road would be flooded. Not just a few inches either. Sometimes after a big storm this would happen, and we would have to park at the fork and then hike through water to get to the cabin, and sometimes come back to the car in a canoe. I guess this is a good time to mention that I was driving a 2000 Golf GTI. When I got to the fork, my worst fear had come true. In my 25 years of coming to this cabin, I had never seen the road flooded like this. It literally looked like the road just ended and the lake began. It looked like a boat ramp more than a road. The clearance on my car was about 5 to 6 inches, and I had actually cracked the oil pan on the car by bottoming out on the rock the year before, driving down this very same road. With the truck headlights coming up behind us, I was forced to make a decision. I could either stop the car and wait for the truck that had been following us in the woods in the middle of the night, allowing who the hell knows to catch up with us, or I could risk driving my car completely unequipped for off-road scenarios, down a very flooded dirt road in the middle of the night. I dropped the car into second gear and drove into the water, hoping that it wasn't as deep as it looked. Shit. The water was even higher than it looked. At first, it came up just beneath the headlights, and then, when the road dipped, it came over the headlights, which killed 90% of my visibility. I looked out the passenger side window, and it looked like the lake came up to the edge of the car. It was just black, sitting, floating along through the middle of a black lake is the only way I can describe it. Is it safe to be doing this? My wife said. Obviously, scared. No, of course not. I was incredibly stupid to be doing it. What the hell was I thinking? But we didn't have a cell service, and we couldn't call if we got stuck, or call to help if the truck decided to follow us. Probably not. But I can't stop now, I said, and gave the car more gas. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the truck, just sitting at the mouth of our road, at the edge of the floodwater. I felt absolutely sick. Not only had it turned down my road, but it would also have a much easier time navigating the flooded road than my tiny Golf Plus, even if I made it. If they followed, we would have nowhere to go. It was a dead end. I can't remember a time in recent memory where I felt so helpless. I am not a big guy, so if there was more than one person in that truck, and they wanted to make trouble, they could. And they would have the perfect place to do it. I started to think of things I had in the car that I could use as a weapon if I needed to. But I knew that I didn't have anything that I could get to quickly. Waves upon waves of regret and fear washed over me. It was really hard to gauge where the road was, but having driven down this road hundreds of times, and judging by the trees on either side of me, I knew the road would start to climb up soon, and hopefully the water wouldn't be as deep. I was right. After what had felt like an eternity, I felt the car start to climb up and out of the water, uncovering the headlights. Inch by inch, the car climbed higher and higher, until it was out of water and on dry land. My heart almost burst out with joy. I checked my mirror again to see the truck was still just sitting at the beginning of the road. I punched the gas and ripped around the upcoming corner. At this point, I knew the road very well, and knew that it would not be flooded again at any further point. But I was worried that after seeing my car make it through the water, that the truck would follow us. When we got to the cabin, I shut off the car and just waited for the truck headlights to appear around the corner. They never came. After we got inside and locked the doors, we talked about how weird the whole encounter was, but still tried to play it cool. Yeah, they must have been lost, and then decided to turn around after seeing the conditions of the road that it was in, I said. I made jokes about how stupid I was for driving through the water, but underneath it all, I was still freaked the hell out and on high alert. Whoever was in the truck knew where we were, and knew it wouldn't be easy for us to leave. Hell, all they would have to do is park at the end of the road and wait for us. I spent the rest of the night listening for car engines and waiting for headlights to start coming down the road. After a few beers and a movie, we eventually fell asleep. But even then, it was not a restful sleep. I just lay awake in bed, listening and waiting for the sound of an axe by the door and my knife on the bedside table. It sucked. The next morning, I drove back down the flooded road, which was still really risky, and parked at the fork. The truck was nowhere to be seen, and no one bothered us for the rest of the weekend. It all turned out well, but it still ranks as the creepiest encounter I've ever had. This happened earlier this year. It happened in the same cabin that my wife and I had that experience in a few years ago, with the guys following us in our car. It's kind of a weird coincidence that I have another story to tell about the exact same place. So, as I mentioned before, my family owns a cabin in upstate New Hampshire, and it is literally my favorite place in the world. It's on a small, very secluded lake, shared by only a few other cabins, one other cabin on my side, with 6 in total. Most of my neighbours only visit during the spring and fall months, and even then, it's pretty rare to run into one of them. We all pretty much leave each other to do our own thing, but we also try to look out for each other the best we can. When we occasionally check in on each other's property during off-season visits, just to be sure there haven't been any damages from storms or break-ins. We all try to be good neighbours, because the lake is a pretty popular fishing location in the area, and as a result of it being so secluded, it's not unusual to see people who don't live on lake out in a boat or hiking around with a fishing pole. In the winter, it becomes a popular place for ice fishing and snowmobiling. So again, it kind of reinforces why all of us who own the property on the lake try to look out for one another, as there are people coming and going at all times of the year. There have been a few break-ins on the lake over the last few years, but honestly, in the 30 years I've now been going up to the cabin, there have only been a handful. Occasionally, someone's canoe or kayak will go missing, but that's pretty much the worst of it, until this winter. My wife and I decided to take a long vacation at the cabin this winter. She was getting ready to start a new job, and I had leftover holiday time from the previous year, so we figured we should take the opportunity to get away before our schedules started, to get busy again in the spring. It was sort of an impromptu vacation, but once we got the idea of spending a week alone together, relaxing by the wood stove, drinking craft beer, winter hiking and binge watching DVDs, we couldn't get it out of our heads. 2 weeks later, we were packed up in my father's F-150 and on the road. Things got wacky immediately. But first, there are a couple of things that you need to know about this location. The lake basically sits in the middle of a dead zone, as far as wireless reception goes. Sometimes you can randomly pick up a few bars of service, but never with certainty. The isolation and feeling of being unplugged is one of the main reasons I love going up to the cabin. It becomes a lot easier to not be glued to your phone when you physically can't be. Secondly, as I mentioned before, this place is secluded. It's a solid 10-minute drive before cell reception kicks in with any sort of consistency, and about another 5 before you reach a town. A couple of years ago, and after much debate within the family, we decided to break down and get a satellite dish installed, so we would have some connectivity to the outside world. We essentially have basic cable for news, weather and a phone line. However, my folks have the service suspended at the start of winter, since our family rarely visits during those months. So my wife and I were heading up without a phone connection, but it had never been a problem before, so we didn't really think anything of it. It hadn't snowed too much in our area, but the ground was still covered in a few inches of old snow, and there were snowmobile tracks all over the place. Before reaching the final turnoff towards the cabin, you have to drive across a causeway. And while crossing, you get a really good view of both sides of the lake. It had been cold for a few weeks straight, so the lake was frozen over, and I looked out over the lake and saw what appeared to be 2 guys ice fishing, sitting on a picnic table out in the middle of our side of the lake. It was my neighbour's picnic table. I knew right away that it was his because of the very distinct paint job. This exact thing had actually happened before, and the last group of fishermen that did this left the table out on the ice, and it fell through once the lake started to thaw. So because of this, my neighbour had chained his new picnic table to concrete footing on the edge of his property. So that means these guys either broke the table to get it out onto the lake, or they broke the chain. I am also pretty confident that it wasn't my neighbour out on the ice, because he lives in Florida, doesn't fish, and never visits during the winter. This pissed me off. I say something along the lines of, "Again? What the hell is their problem?" to my wife, and she reciprocates in a similar fashion. Since both of us were in agreement, I sped up to get to the cabin and confronted them before they could run off. I didn't really have a plan, but I figured I would yell at them and threaten to call the cops if they didn't put it back, which I couldn't actually do. I kind of figured as soon as they saw the truck turn down the road, they would take off anyway. I was right, but oddly, more right than I knew. As I came down the road, I noticed a few things that struck me as odd. First, there were 2 dudes jumping onto and starting up snowmobiles that were parked in front of my neighbour's cabin. Second, the front door to the cabin was wide open, the lights were on, and there was smoke coming out of the chimney. I stopped the truck about 50 feet from his driveway and watched as the 2 guys drove their snowmobiles out onto the lake, picked up their buddies, and sped off across the lake into the woods. We kind of just sat there for a minute or so, dumbfounded. I wasn't really sure what was going on, but it definitely didn't feel right. I guess it was technically possible that my neighbour was visiting, or that maybe he rented his cabin out to some people, but my gut told me that this was not the case. There were no cars in his driveway, and the guys on the snowmobiles were definitely in some sort of hurry when we pulled up. Also, it was about 10 degrees outside, so why would they leave the door open? After snapping out of it, I parked the truck in front of our cabin and walked over to the edge of the lake. Sound travels pretty well out there, and I could hear the snowmobiles getting further and further away. I unlocked our cabin, threw a quick start log in the wood stove, and then my wife and I headed over to the neighbour's cabin with our dog. I called out hello a few times, and then I tried yelling for my neighbour, but got nothing back. As we got closer, I could clearly see the front door was splintered and had been pried open. My wife and I had unknowingly pulled up while people were actively breaking into my neighbour's cabin. Not exactly an ideal way to start a relaxing winter getaway. My family is on really good terms with my neighbours, so I went ahead and stepped inside to check it out. There was a fresh pile of wood by the stove, which was roaring, and the kitchen had some paper plates, food, empty beer cans, and cigarette butts strewn about. Nothing seemed broken or missing that I could tell, but the place was an absolute mess and reeked of cigarettes. It was as if they had just decided to help themselves and make my neighbour's cabin their own private fishing lodge for a while. There were some sleeping bags and a cooler in the living room, so it looked like they had been planning to stay for more than a day. I wasn't in the cabin for more than a minute or so, and I was careful not to touch anything. I did, however, snap a few pictures for my neighbours and the cops, and then I snuffed out the wood stove, and I also decided to close the front door as best I could when I left, while wearing gloves, since we were going to have to leave in order to get in touch with the police and my neighbour, and I didn't want the front door being left wide open. The next couple of hours were pretty bunk. We drove into town, reported the break-in to the police, and after giving our report, we got in touch with my neighbour, who was understandably very upset. I did my best to assure him that things weren't too bad, all things considered, and that there would just be some cleaning up to do. I offered to do it, since we were going to be up there all week, but he insisted that he wanted to see it all for himself. He was going to make plans to fly up from Florida to deal with everything as soon as he could, but asked if I could nail a couple of boards across the broken door for now. The police were heading out to check the property. When we got back to our cabin, the police were already at my neighbour's checking things out. One of them came over and asked if I could walk them through everything that happened. I retold the story and ended it with something along the lines of, "So I left after shutting down the stove and closed the door behind me." I got some weird looks, and then the conversation went something like this: "Are you sure you closed the door? Because it was open when we got here." "Yes, I definitely closed the door." "Well, it was open, and the items you described aren't there either. The sleeping bags, the cooler, they aren't there, so it looks like they came back and got them." This was pretty unnerving for the same reason. Why risk coming all the way back for some sleeping bags and a cooler with getting away? After getting away, they wouldn't have known for certain that we did or didn't call the police right away, so the cops suspected that they were watching us and came back right after we left, or that there was someone else in the area who we didn't see. I listened to the snowmobiles driving off, and they got pretty far away. They kept going until I couldn't hear them anymore, and the woods on the other side of the lake, a completely untouched wilderness for a few miles. I know this because I hunt turkeys out there, so I personally think there was someone else close by watching us. My wife really liked that little bit of information. Especially since, only a few years ago, we had basically been followed by creepers on a previous trip to our cabin. The whole situation was just a giant downer. After a while, the cops finished up and let us know that they would keep a cruiser in the area. Not that that would really help, and that they were going back to check on the other cabins for any signs of break-ins. I nailed my neighbor's door shut, dragged the picnic table off the ice, as they had cut the chain, and headed back inside for a much-needed beer, or four. We had debated a little about cancelling the trip and heading back home for a staycation, but honestly, we were determined to enjoy our week because we had really been looking forward to it. So we decided to stay. The next couple of days were great. We did exactly what we planned on doing, which was mostly nothing. We watched movies, snuggled, drank in excess, and made my world-famous chili, and my wife ate it. We had bacon, eggs, and mimosas for breakfast, beer, grilled cheese, and mediocre red box movies for lunch, and vodka tonics, hearty winter meals, and sexy times for dinner. It was awesome. Granted, every time we heard a snowmobile, we both gave each other an "oh shit" look. But after a few times, we were joking about it, and our "oh shit" looks morphed into a game of who can make the funniest face. We were just generally having a great time. As much as we were enjoying being completely overindulgent bed bunnies, by midweek, we wanted to stretch our legs, so we decided to go for a hike. It was a beautiful day, and I knew the surrounding area very well, so I suggested we hike up to the dam at the mouth of the river that feeds the lake. It freezes over in winter and looks pretty cool. It was around a 2 or 3 hour hike round trip, depending on the place. Short and sweet. We brought our dog along, and again, we were having a great time, enjoying the extremely scenic winter woods and each other's company. On our way back, things took an unfortunate turn. About 2-ish miles, 30 minutes from the cabin, we hear the whine of snowmobiles. We each made a funny face and joked. Then it got quiet and we kept listening. They were getting closer. At the time, it wasn't exactly unexpected. It was a gorgeous day out, and we were smack dab in the middle of prime snowmobile territory. But given everything that had happened earlier that week, it was impossible not to feel at least a little uneasy. The snowmobiles kept getting closer, and the whine was getting louder and louder. My wife and I spoke about something, but honestly, I really wasn't listening to her. I was going over the situation in my head, and I don't quite remember what we were talking about. The engine sounds were getting louder, and it was obvious they were coming down the same trail that we were on. I suppose it could have been anyone, perhaps a father and son enjoying the day, or a couple of friends off to meet up with some of their buddies. Regardless, I just got a very bad feeling. I carry a gun as a direct result of the last weird encounter I had at the cabin. So I made the executive decision to unholster, rack around into the chamber, and reholster just in case. Not here to debate the pros and cons of gun carrying, but I do what I do, and did what I did, and I felt good about it. The trail we were on was about 5 or 6 feet wide, so once the snowmobiles came into view, I picked up our dog and then we stood off to the edge of the trail so that they could pass us. I think we played it pretty standard as far as general common courtesy goes. As soon as they saw us, they both stopped in the middle of the trail, about 100 feet from where we were standing. I waved, and they didn't wave back. I could see they were talking back and forth, occasionally looking at us. They seemed to finish up their conversation and gunned their engines. Both of them started approaching very fast and appeared to be in a line to hit us. My wife and I stepped back a few steps into the brush and they buzz us full throttle. I'm talking inches, not feet. They continue past us for a bit and then stop, turn back and look at us. I instinctively, almost as a reflex, threw up my free arm, holding a furiously barking Boston Terrier in the other, and yelled, "What the hell is your problem?" One of them replied with a middle finger, revved the engine a few times, and then they both took off down the trail. My wife was a wreck afterwards. I was scared, but she was really scared. The trail we were on basically ends where our property begins, so if it was the same people from earlier that week, they would know we weren't home. We had another 30 minutes of hiking before we got back, and the whole time we could hear the snowmobiles ahead of us. They didn't disappear and get further away like before. The whole walk back, they were completely within earshot. About after 10 minutes, we could hear that they had stopped, and then started driving around at low RPM. The engines were running, but not at the full throttle. After a few minutes we stopped and waited. They started at full blast again, this time getting further and further away. We waited until we couldn't hear them again, and then headed for the cabin. When we got back, there were snowmobile tracks all around the property, front and back. They had been circling the cabin. We had no way to call the police, so after an extremely short and extremely tense conversation, we promptly packed up, closed the cabin, and left for home. Vacation officially ruined. We contacted the police, but there wasn't much to say other than a couple of assholes on snowmobiles almost ran us over and then drove all over our property. We may have been more selective with our words, and the police were certainly sympathetic, and again, given the break-in at my neighbour's, they seemed pretty concerned about it. But in the end, there wasn't much for them to do. We gave descriptions, our information, and left. The thing that gets to me the most is that even though my wife acts like it didn't bother her too much, I know it did. I have been going to that cabin my entire life, and some of the best memories I have up there are on that lake. Now, I not only have one, but two terrible and frightening experiences at that cabin, where the person I love the most in the world was potentially at risk. I'd never ask her to go somewhere she didn't feel safe, and honestly, I'm not sure I will feel safe going up there anymore. The good news is that both my neighbours and my family decided to have a proper alarm system installed, so at the very least, someone will be alerted to any future break-in attempts. However, it still doesn't help with the fact that when you are far away from help, you are essentially at the mercy of others. I know and believe that the vast majority of people are good-natured, but I am learning that all it takes is one person, or multiple in my case, to really ruin your day. This happened to my parents back in the late 80s. They were in their mid-20s when all of this occurred. My parents decided to go camping in cool California. When they get there, it was kind of late. My mom was sitting down on a log, while my dad was unpacking the truck. While sitting down, they heard walking around the campsite. So, my mum went and quietly told my dad that she heard someone walking around. And they noped out of there just in case. They drove around 3 miles down the road with their headlights off so that they wouldn't be followed. They drove about 3 miles down the road with their headlights off so that they wouldn't be followed. Once they got there, they set up camp and began to drink their asses off while listening to a boxing match on the radio. Eventually, they settled in for the night. Now, they didn't know for sure that this next event is connected to the first, but they believed that it was. So, they settled in, and my dad was asleep far before my mum. My mum was in the halfway state, where you're half awake and half asleep. Suddenly, she heard footsteps from outside the tent. She abruptly snapped back to consciousness and listened. She tried waking my dad, but he was too far out of it. She listened for what seemed like hours, when suddenly she hears, in the creepiest tone you can imagine, someone say that they're here and that they're going to kill them. While saying this, the man ran a knife along the tent. She could hear him walking and dragging the knife. She was literally frozen. She couldn't say anything or move, with her mouth agape. She finally snapped out of it and screamed for Jim to grab the shotgun and to kill the son of a bitch. With that, my dad finally woke up, and they heard the snapping of twigs and footsteps, and heard the guy run away. Of course, my parents did not have a shotgun. It was a huge bluff that actually worked. My dad got up seconds later and began to run after him, but of course he was long gone. After that, my parents decided they were getting the hell out of there before anything else could happen, when they saw their tires were slashed. They were both in the middle of nowhere, and no way out, with some maniac that wanted to kill them. They actually tried blowing up their tires with one of those things you use to blow up rafts. Obviously that didn't work, but they had to try. About an hour or so later, a ranger that was patrolling the area came along and helped them out. He brought them back to town so they could get their tires fixed. While speaking to the ranger, they found out that he had been searching for any suspicious activity due to recent murders nearby. My parents were likely the next murder victims. When I was a kid, I grew up at a campground. I literally spent the whole summer there, as a relative managed it and worked night security, so I'd been camping throughout my life. On my 21st birthday, some buddies and I decided to go on a trip. and do some real camping way out in the bush. We Google mapped a nice spot near a small river along the coast of Lake Superior and set off on our way. It was only a few hours to the boat launch, and we would canoe along the beach for a few miles to get to this spot. We're talking real remote. The nearest road was 5 miles, and other than trekking through the woods, the only way to get there would be to go back the way we came along this beach. So we set up camp near dark, get a nice fire going, and bullshit and drink for a few hours. By around midnight, we are all getting tired, after all the paddling and stuff we had to do. So we popped into our tents. Now, even though I have been camping my whole life, I am still a very light sleeper, and I can hear something move around outside the tents. On the periphery of the campsite, heavy steps, but clearly they are shoes. Naturally, I assume it's one of my friends going to take a whiz, even though I didn't hear any tent zippers. The steps fade or wade towards the beach, and after 20 minutes or so, I forget about them and begin to drift off to sleep. Next morning, we all get up and start making breakfast and collecting wood. The walking never comes up, and we carry on. Later in the day, we all head to the river to do some fishing and split off into groups. I'm fishing with the friend in the tent next to mine, and when the other guys split off, he starts asking if I heard anything last night. I tell him about the footsteps, and he nods. He then tells me that about an hour after they walked off, they came back. I mentioned to him it was probably someone from camp, and he tells me that he doesn't think so because they never went into a tent. He says that the steps walked past the tents and carried on into the woods. Jump forward to the next day of the trip. No footsteps are heard all through the week until the last night. We all settle early since we have to pack all our shit up and paddle back. And about half an hour in, I can hear the steps off at the back edge of the clearing again. They're kind of faint, but as I can start to hear them more clearly, they pick up the pace until they're at a full run, and they storm past all the tents, back towards the beach again. We're talking full speed sprint. If you've ever heard a person running whilst you're still, it's loud as shit. This time, we all wake up, and everybody climbs out of their tents, flashlights ready. Everyone is present, but there was no sign of whatever or whoever was running. The soil in the area was fairly soft. If it was a bear or deer, there would be clear prints, and if it were human, there would have definitely been some footprints. But even the tall grass wasn't disturbed at the edge of the site. Nobody got any sleep after that. We packed up all our shit except the chairs and waited around the fire until the sun came up. It's 2 a.m. here, and even though I know I'm thousands of miles away, it still gives me the creeps. A year ago, my grandfather in Malaysia died. Malaysian tradition is that you have to look over the body at all times until it's buried or cremated. I think that this was to stop any evil spirits from potentially possessing the body. Now, my grandfather was essentially a bad man. He was a pretty powerful member of the Triads and got most of my uncles into it. He was a great family man though, and he treated all of us with kindness and respect. His body was in his house, which was basically bordering a forest. Now, as he was a Triad chief, there were over 50 armed men there and a lot of relatives, either sleeping in the house or in the massive lawn. All the forest had, in terms of wildlife, were snakes, monkeys and wild boars. Nothing too dangerous or scary, or so I thought. The day after we first arrived, some of the men found a monkey on the outskirts of the forest, dead. Its stomach had been completely ripped open, and its face, I'll never forget its face. It had such a human look of terror that it will haunt me forever. The really creepy part is that there was barely any blood on the ground where it was. That meant that something or someone had killed it somewhere else and placed it there for us to find. That night, I got guard duty for the night. This basically meant that myself and some other men had to babysit my grandfather's coffin. Creepy, right? Anyway, that night was weird. Like all forests, you'll get noises like monkeys screaming and birds calling. But on this night, it was completely goddamn silent, and it scared the shit out of me. Heck, it scared the guys who I was with, who were all armed, literally to the teeth, who were probably serious criminals and potential murderers. At around 3 AM, these two guys wanted to go outside for a smoke. I was kinda bored, but I decided to join them. I remember, before I left, one of the older men there called me over and handed me a .22. He told me the forest didn't seem right tonight, and to be careful, and that it was loaded. I had learnt to shoot before, but this was only my second or third time that I had handled a gun outside of a range. So I walked out into the quiet night with these two guys. There were actually a few people around, but, like us, they were kind of freaked out by the forest. Anyway, so I was walking slightly behind them, rifle hanging on my shoulder and a torch in my hand. They were just shooting the shit and lighting up when I heard the noise. It sounded like a huge man was running through thick branches, but it seemed to be coming from the trees. I ran up to the guys, and they heard it too. These tough gangsters looked like pedos on their first day in prison. One of them, white-faced, pointed at a high spot on a tree. This thing was standing on a branch. It looked like an orangutan, with really long hairs, but it was standing completely upright and was at least 6 feet tall. But its eyes, I'll never forget its eyes. They glowed a dull red, and the longer I stared at it, the more depressed I became. I had an urge to walk into the forest and leave everything behind forever. I had taken a step forward when one of the guys started shooting. He was crying, chanting verses, and basically screaming at the thing. I don't know whether he hit it or not, but the thing just vanished. We hightailed it back to the house, but we never saw it again. When we told everyone what we saw, they just became really quiet and refused to talk about it further. My mum and I left that afternoon. Later I learned the two guys had died quite recently. One was gutted in a street fight with a rival gang, and the other hanged himself. Although I haven't been back to that place since that happened, I always hear stories about how that place doesn't feel right, and occasionally a dead animal will turn up in the front yard. I worked with Parks Canada, our version of the National Forestry, or something like that. My team and I were all bear specialists. We worked at Glacier and Revelstoke National Parks, which both have two of the highest grizzly and black bear populations in the world. Our first day, we met a warden who had terrible scarring all over his face from trying to follow our training about dealing with a bear and having said bear rip half his face off. So we figured our training was horseshit. We found this out one day while hiking to an outpost cabin in Glacier when one of my co-workers ignored all the bear awareness training we received, like making noises and acting really big. I always assumed that meant walking around yelling you had an 8-inch penis. Anyway, Kirk, the idiot, doesn't do anything to avoid bears, and he turns a corner. And what does he see? Yep, a black bear, eye to eye. Kirk did nothing right and screamed like a girl and ran away. All the things you're not supposed to do. Luckily, the even stupider bear did the exact same thing and ran off in the other direction. What an idiot. Just goes to show, bear training may not always be that good. Certainly wasn't, in this case anyway. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I'd like to thank everyone who entered the last two competitions. It's a shame that not everyone can win, but there will be more to come. Creeks and Peaks and myself have another competition in the works, so keep an eye out for when it drops in a few days, and best of luck for then. If you enjoyed the video, please remember to give it a big thumbs up and consider subscribing for even more stories every day. Don't forget that if you would like me to read your story on my channel, feel free to send it to my email or share it to my Reddit, which is of course available in the description. Please make sure to include as much description and punctuation as possible to maximize the chances of it being read. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.